Okay, tell me, Ms. Johnston, when President Kennedy announced the formation of the Peace Corps?
In March 1st, 1961.
Very good. And what type of an agency was it, Kelly?
It was an agency to provide
No, not the description. What type was it, just in general?
government agency.
That was considered temporary. Very good. Now, I'll let you go ahead and answer that now. What did the organization, what was it established to do there, Kelly?
It was established to provide things to a developing nation, such as humanitarian aid and education.
Very good. And Emma, who did he choose to organize and oversee that organization?
Sergeant
Which was his
brother.
brother-in-law. Very good. Now, it's kind of interesting how the Peace Corps went because it's a little different now than it was then. When it was first started, it was and it still is, it's a voluntary organization. Okay? And what I mean by that is you volunteer and you're paid a little bit of a stipend, which is a living wage. But who are the type of people, what's the story? Who are the type of people that would join the Peace Corps in the early 60s? Anybody want to get? What's that? Well, possibly. That's just in general. Who are the type of people that join the Peace Corps today? Anybody know?
Smart people.
Completely opposite. I'll just tell you. In 1961, it was usually youths out of college. It was young people that volunteered for the Peace Corps. Okay, so most of the people that decide that they want to take part in this organization that was going to provide humanitarian aid and education to underdeveloped nations were youths out of college. That was the biggest majority. There wasn't a lot of older people involved. It was mainly young people who volunteered. Now, what these volunteers would do is they'd travel to these less advantaged countries and they would educate the people there in these three areas. Okay, these were the three areas in which these volunteers, usually youths out of college, would educate these underprivileged or less advantaged countries in these three areas. First of all, they would educate the people of the country academically. Okay? What do I mean by that, Mauricio? That they're going to educate them academically.
Math and English.
Mainly the four cores: math, science, English, social studies. So they weren't very well educated academically. So that was one thing they were going to educate them in, was academics. Mainly your four cores: math, science, English, social studies. What else might they educate them in, Alex? What else might they help them with in an underprivileged country? Yeah, very good. Health education, and what maybe didn't these people have the best of that we would see as kind of gross today? Personal hygiene. So they were educated, as Alex said, in health education, medical, how to take care of themselves that way. And also a lot of them had to be educated in personal hygiene and what was the best to keep yourself in the best shape you could. So they educated the people of the country academically, they educated the people of the country in health education or hygiene. What might be another one, Glenn? You're into this business. What might be another thing they educated them on? Very good. Agricultural matters. Taught them how to farm. Taught them the benefits of water on crops, of irrigation, of fertilization, those types of things. So they advised them on agricultural matters. So these people, usually youths out of college, would go into these underdeveloped countries and they would educate them academically, teach them how to read, write, do math, simple math, those types of things. They also would teach them how to take care of themselves from a medical standpoint, including personal hygiene. And they also would go in and educate them on agricultural matters, how to plant seed, how to grow, how water works with that, how to put an irrigation system in, how to fend for yourself, so to speak, because these countries are very primitive at the time. Now this was, as Hannah said, initiated on March 1st of 1961, right? By the end of 1963, just prior to the president's assassination, there were over 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers serving in 40 different countries around the world. So again, by late 1963, prior to the president's assassination, there were over 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers who served in 40 different countries. So did it turn from a temporary governmental agency to a what? Permanent, which exists still today. So again, by late 1963, prior to the president's assassination, there were over 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers serving in 40 different countries. So the Peace Corps proved to be a big success, still exists today. Now, my question is, what type of people now tend to volunteer for the Peace Corps? Retired people. Seriously, people that retire and looking for something to do. So it's made kind of that transition. Now, I'm not saying there's not youths that still volunteer, but the biggest percentage of people now in our time are people who have retired and are looking for a service project or something to do in retirement. Okay? So, the Peace Corps. Okay, that'll take us to kind of a serious event here, real early in Kennedy's presidency, and that was the Bay of Pigs affair. Bay of Pigs affair. This is a big deal here, because what was one of the criticisms that Kennedy had to overcome when he ran for president, other than his age, other than his religion? His age and inexperience. Okay, got a young guy, can he get the job done? Well, what was the biggest concern Kennedy had, really, when he took office as president? It was American morale toward the Soviet Union. Okay? His biggest concern when he took over the presidency was American morale toward the Soviet Union. What do I mean by American morale, Ashton, toward the Soviet Union? What's your job as a cheerleader? Build school spirit and morale, so we think we're better than Buffalo this weekend. Well, Kennedy's biggest concern was, what was America's morale towards the Soviet Union? My God, were the Soviets going to take over the world? Were we going to end up under communist rule? And when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'll get more of an idea what that meant. But that was a big concern. What, do we think that we're as good as we are? Do we think that we're going to succumb to communism? He was concerned about that. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to take some quick, bold action to help Americans regain their confidence with Russia. Okay? He wanted to do something that would show America, by God, we're not only even with these communist son of a guns, but we're actually better. So he was looking to take some sort of quick, bold action to boost American morale concerning the Soviet Union and where we were heading in that direction. Because communism was a big deal right now. You've heard of the Cold War. Cold War is no war that's fought on a battlefield. It's just a real cold, frigid relationship between all the non-communist countries in the world and the communist countries in the world that may lead to a major war, which people are afraid of might be the next World War. So it was a big thing. Well, we had a little bit of an issue because we had a country that was less than 100 miles away from Key West, Florida, that had very strong ties with the Soviet Union, and that was Cuba. And it was led by a dictator by the name of Fidel Castro, which is on your ID sheet. So Kennedy knew that we had a threat to non-communist activity less than 100 miles away because of Cuba and Fidel Castro's great relationship with the Soviet Union. So we didn't necessarily have to worry about a country that was thousands of miles away. We had one within 100 miles that we were eventually going to have a real big dealing with here before long. Now, the United States, keep this in mind, never liked Fidel Castro. He was a mean dictator in their minds. He was forcing people to stay in Cuba under communist rule. We did not like communism 99 miles away from Key West, Florida. And so way before Kennedy ever took office, the United States wanted to free Cuba from Castro's control and make them non-communist. I mean, that went on for years. Okay? Well, actually, in the late 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, they had started a plan to deal with and get rid of Castro. So even before Kennedy took office, the Eisenhower administration in the late 1950s actually started to put together a plan to free Cuba from Castro, thus free the country from communism. So this plan had already kind of been in motion, and what happened? Eisenhower ran out of term before anything could be done, right? So what was Kennedy's? Well, I'll tell you about the plan first, okay, then we'll go from there. So this was the plan that was initiated by the Eisenhower administration. The United States was going to invade Cuba using Cuban army exiles. Cuban army exiles. Were we going to use our own soldiers? No, we were going to use Cuban army exiles. Taylor Fulfer, what's an exile?
Someone who's
no longer in the Cuban army because they have been kicked out, basically exiled out of the country. So they would have a reason to be a little pissed off at the Cuban government, would they not? So this plan that Eisenhower put together consisted of an invasion of Cuba, but they were going to use Cuban army exiles, a person that would be banished from their own country. And guess who was training these Cuban army exiles for the invasion? The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. So the original plan during the Eisenhower administration consisted of an invasion of Cuba by Cuban army exiles, people that are banished from their own country, after being trained by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. What better people to pick than people that are mad at their country, right? I mean, okay? Now, there had to be goals for the invasion. What were the 3 goals that the invasion was going to accomplish? Now tell me if you think this makes sense. So this invasion of Cuba by Cuban army exiles was supposed to accomplish these 3 things. 1, it was going to trigger an anti-communist attitude in the country. It was going to trigger an anti-communist attitude in the country. What are we banking on if we're saying that we believe, we predict that an invasion of Cuba by Cuban army exiles is going to trigger an anti-communist attitude? What are we betting on there, Callie?
Yeah, we're going to cause them to start throwing civil war.
Sort of, but what are we banking on? That those people that are under communist rule don't like to be under communist rule, but they're afraid of the military and the dictator, so they just say, okay. So we think it's going to trigger an anti-communist attitude. Now, if it triggers that anti-communist attitude, it accomplishes the second thing. As Callie said, she said civil war, but I'm going to say a revolt by the Cuban citizens against Castro's dictatorship. Okay? So if the invasion accomplishes the first goal of triggering an anti-communist attitude, then it should follow up with a revolt by Cuban citizens against Castro's dictatorship. Okay? So, the invasion of Cuba was to accomplish 3 things. First, trigger an anti-communist attitude, which would lead to a revolt by Cuban citizens against Castro's dictatorship, which would lead to what? If they revolt against his, think about what happened then. And the possible or probable assassination of Fidel Castro. So that was the plan that the Eisenhower put into effect. That they were going to train Cuban army exiles. They were going to invade Cuba, which they believed would lead to an anti-communist attitude, to trigger an anti-communist attitude, which would lead to those people in that country revolting against the Castro dictatorship, which would lead to Castro's assassination and freedom for the people of Cuba away from communism. That was the plan. So who inherited that plan? Kennedy. So he wants to take some quick, bold action to help our morale against communism, but he has to study this thing. I mean, you just don't, if you're the President of the United States, you don't just jump into this. So it will be President Kennedy's decision to either initiate or continue this Eisenhower plan, or maybe think of some other way to take some quick, bold action. So what the President did is he studied the plan. And who did he communicate with the most, do you think, about this whole thing before he made his decision? Well, he did with his brother, but who did he want information from? Not Eisenhower, the CIA. So he briefed the CIA on many occasions, and if you were the President, wouldn't you want to know what your commitment, what's my commitment? I get what you're going to do, but as President of the United States, what do you need from me to make this thing work? Other than the training of the Cuban army exiles by the CIA. There's got to be another, I mean, this has got to be there's got to be a catch to this. What do I need? Well, when Kennedy talked to the CIA, they informed him they would need the following 3 things. These are the 3 things that Kennedy would have to commit to if they were going to make this invasion work and be successful. This is what he had to commit to. First of all, those exiles, how are they going to invade the Cuban country? It's kind of an island, isn't it? They're gonna need boats, right? They're gonna land on the beaches, right? But what do they need to be safe to land on the beaches? What? They don't need parachutes. Well, they're gonna come in on boats. Air support. They're gonna need air support. So Kennedy would have to provide United States air support for the exiles during the invasion. In other words, he's gonna have to, if you provide air support to people invading a country, are you going to be shooting at the enemy, so to speak?
Yeah.
Sure you are. You're going to be providing air support. You're going to be protecting them to make sure they can get on the beaches. Okay, so he's going to have to commit air support. What else? Now we're going to let the exiles do their thing. They're going to trigger this anti-communist revolt. They're going to assassinate Castro, and when that's all done, if the plan goes as it's supposed to, what commitments Kennedy going to need to put in then? Well, that's right, we'll say that. But first of all, he's going to have to commit American troops to come in there and kind of mop up, okay? Because he's going to have to go in there and restore order, is he not? Because these Cuban exiles are going to be, attacking the beaches. All these people that are in Cuba that hate Castro are going to revolt. They're going to have a mess there when they get done. And somebody's going to have to go in and restore order to get them back to normal, so to speak, and that's going to be American troops. So, first of all, air cover for the exiles. Second of all, the use of American troops to mop up after the invasion was over to restore order. And then what, Brianna?
They're going to have to put in a leader.
Put in a democratic government in Cuba. So Kennedy's commitment, if he goes with this plan, is A, he's going to have to provide air support for those exiles as they try to make it to the beaches of Cuba in their invasion. 2, he's going to have to provide American military troops to mop up after the invasion's over, clean it up, so there'll be a presence of the military. And 3, he's got to set up a democratic government after the mop-up has been done. That's his commitment. So Kennedy thinks about this, he consults with his advisors, and like Mauricio, I think, said, probably talked quite a bit with his brother. And finally, after thinking this whole thing over, he decided to give the CIA permission to enact this particular plan. So after studying and consulting with his advisors, Kennedy granted the CIA permission to continue Eisenhower's plan and make it happen. As a result, on April 17th, 1961, how early into Kennedy's administration is that? February, March, April, just 3 months into his first administration, a force of 1,500 Cuban army exiles land on the southern coast of Cuba, also known as the Bay of Pigs. So, on April 17, 1961, a force of approximately 1,500 Cuban army exiles trained by the CIA landed on the southern coast of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs. I'll repeat that again. On April 17, 1961, a force of approximately 1,500 Cuban army exiles trained by the CIA landed at the southern coast of Cuba at an area known as the Bay of Pigs. The entire operation turns out to be a complete disaster for the United States. And not only for the United States, but for the Kennedy administration early in their term. So this entire invasion, entire operation, the entire plan turns out to be an absolute disaster for the United States and a really poor showing by the Kennedy administration. And there are 3 reasons why. 3 reasons why this thing went to hell in a handbasket. Now, the first reason I'll try to explain to you concerning the topography. There are some mountainous lands along the beaches of Cuba. However, the landing site that was chosen by the CIA for this invasion was too far from those mountains, so they had basically no protection. Okay? Can you imagine? I mean, if you have to run from here to Mrs. Triple's room, now you're getting shot at, because it's that distance you got cover, and comparing to run to here, maybe to the office, there's a big difference. Distance and the fact that the mountains were not close enough to provide cover, because once they got into the mountains, would they be harder to find? No doubt. But if you're on a straight, flat beach area, it's going to be pretty easy pickings. Now, I want you to think about, okay, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So that's first reason. Landing site chosen by the CIA was too far from the mountains, which were to provide protection for the exiles during the invasion. Secondly, this revolt or this anti-communist attitude that was supposed to be triggered because we were sure those people in Cuba were so upset with being oppressed with communism that they would stand up and arm themselves and help, that revolt or that anti-communist attitude never happened. Either the people were satisfied being bonded in a country like that under communism, or they were so afraid of Castro and what he might do if they uprose, that never happened. That was a big part of this thing, right? You're going to send 1,500 exiles in hoping to get 90% of the people to revolt with you. You might have a shot, but when nobody revolts, that's a problem. Now I want you to think about the first thing I said. Even though the landing site chosen by the CIA was too far from the mountains, what might make you think they could still get to the mountains safely? The air support. Problem was, the third reason this went bad is at the very last minute, Kennedy decided not to provide the air support. He decided not to provide the air support. So, landing sites too far from the mountains. Exiles aren't protected as they land on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. The anti-communist attitude, which was supposed to lead to a revolt, never occurred against Castro. And finally, at the last minute, President Kennedy decided not to provide air support. If you don't provide air support, I don't care how close you are to the mountains.